Okay, buckle in guys, because this is going to be a long video. Now, first of all, here's what I want to talk about on this channel. Right now, above all else, I want to talk about Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people, which is being enabled, indeed facilitated, by Western governments. I want to talk about the rise of fascism in the West and beyond. I want to talk about other injustices, and I want to platform more compelling voices than my own who are otherwise erased by the mainstream media. Here's what I don't want to talk about. Me. I'm not that interesting, and it's a distraction from all of that. But alas, sometimes it's necessary and sometimes it's useful and indeed clarifying. So please indulge me. Now, there are, let's put it this way, some criticisms about my record on the question of Palestine, which are circulating. So what I'm going to do is state the facts about that record. And look, first of all, it's really important for me to state this. I should be criticised. I should be scrutinised. I get things wrong. I make mistakes, sometimes big mistakes. I've been around as a writer with a public platform since I was in my mid-20s. I'm now a geriatric millennial who is 40. So when I learn, make mistakes, go on journeys, I do all that in public. That said, the critique I'm going to take head on is that I am some sort of raging Zionist, a champion of Israel, someone who doesn't really support the Palestinian cause and has no record of doing so. One particularly colourful influencer has been in touch to suggest that I have made a career from shilling for Zionism, that I helped cause the genocide, and that I am specifically responsible for the mass slaughter of Palestinian children. Well, as you will see, to put it mildly, I believe this is a straightforward erasure of the truth and of history. And as I'll show, this critique comes from the sort of people who lie by omission, erase the work I've done, twist what I say, take things out of context, or just make stuff up. As I'll show, I have a record there of consistency. Many of the things you hear me say now in 2025, in the worst possible timeline, are the exact same things I was saying when I first started writing in newspapers and going on television a decade and a half ago. Indeed, since my public career, for want of a better term, began in 2011, I've had the following consistent positions on Palestine: opposition to Israel's brutal occupation, to the barbaric siege of Gaza, to the illegal settlements. I've consistently supported sanctions, including a total arms embargo on Israel. I've supported specific boycotts. I've called out the criminal complicity of Western leaders and consistently challenged the role of our diabolical Western media. I've consistently opposed the claim that this is a conflict or a war, given its asymmetrical nature, an occupier backed and armed to the teeth by the West versus a besieged, occupied people subjected to extreme deprivation. I've consistently not just advocated, obviously, for an independent homeland for the Palestinian people, but I have even proposed to a mass audience a one-state solution based on democracy and equal rights for all citizens who live in Palestine. Have my positions firmed up? Absolutely, as I'll discuss. But as I will show, it is a lie to suggest that I've ever used my platform for anything else other than support, unequivocal support for the Palestinian cause. Let's start back in 2012 when I was 28 years old. As you'll see, twin death is real. Now, I became known for my commentary on British politics in particular. My first two books were Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, and The Establishment and How They Get Away With It, both of which were attempts to communicate class politics to a mass audience. That's always been my shtick, if you like. That's been my aim. Socialism for normies. I don't use normies in a pejorative sense. I mean, loser weirdos. Nonetheless, the first appearance I had on television, which went viral, was over Gaza. It was on BBC's Question Time, which is the BBC's flagship political debate programme. And back then, at least, it had millions of viewers. It was during Israel's 2012 onslaught against Gaza. As you listen to what I say, you will hear me making the same exact arguments I make today. I began by taking on the now late Liberal Democrat leader Charles Kennedy, who had made his name opposing the invasion of Iraq, but had given a dire, platitudinous response when it came to Israel's war crimes.
Owen Jones, I'm actually disappointed by that response, Charles, in all honesty. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened. Firstly, this whole idea that Gaza, that Hamas broke the ceasefire, is just not true. In fact, it was broken after, in October, Israel killed 15 Palestinian fighters. They shot dead a mentally disabled Palestinian. They killed another 13-year-old in an intrusion. And when there was an attempt to actually get a ceasefire, negotiations were ongoing. That is when they assassinated Ahmed Jabari, completely ending those ceasefire talks. Now, it's often said, and Barack Obama made this point, he said, what country on earth would tolerate rockets being fired at them? I ask you this, what people on earth would tolerate a siege which stops basic supplies getting in, an occupation, a 45-year-old occupation, a brutal occupation at that, illegal settlements all over the West Bank, which are in total violation of international law, and what we've seen in the course of this onslaught are the deaths of 158 Palestinians, at least 30 of whom are children. Now, we all want a secure and lasting peace. When we have Israeli ministers, like the Interior Minister, calling for Gaza to be sent back to the Middle Ages, when in the last offensive we had another minister calling for a Holocaust to be inflicted on Gaza, when we have the son of Ariel Sharon, who wrote in the Jerusalem Post talking about how Nagasaki and Hiroshima were possible solutions to be inflicted, when we have those people, we won't get a secure peace. But the way we will get it for Arabs and Jews alike, to end the occupation, end the siege of Gaza, and dismantle the illegal settlements, and finally have a just settlement for the Palestinian people, ensuring peace for Arabs and Jews and the region as a whole.
As you can hear, what I tried to do is shift the conversation from the perspective of Israel, where the media was focusing and politicians, to the perspective of the Palestinian people, to center their suffering, to emphasize the genocidal rhetoric emanating from Israel, and to conclude that there would never be peace unless Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people was dismantled. I then made the case for a one-state solution based on equal rights for all. That's always been my preferred personal solution. We'll come on to that, but you can listen to me making the case here.
The crucial point you're making is about the existence of those settlements, and I have to say, what other country on earth would be allowed to flout international law in the way that Israel has done for decades?
But answer her question. Her question.
Well, the key point there...
You heard what she said, which was that the number of people who've now settled on the West Bank make the two-state solution practically impossible.
There are two possible solutions. One is to have a federal solution where you have equal rights for both Arabs and Jews. That seems to many people obviously far-fetched, but they did say that about South Africa back in the day. Otherwise, you have to dismantle the settlements, enforce international law. But what has to happen, because the point is Britain supports, as other Western countries do, they've supported and armed Israel to the teeth. They're not acting as honest brokers. They have to use their pressure to force Israel to give in and give justice to the Palestinian people.
Owen, thank you.
What I tried to do there was take on the sense that a single-state solution based on democracy and equal rights was somehow extreme or utopian by pointing to the precedent of South Africa and the end of apartheid. Again, that's what I've always tried to do, to try and make ideas which are seen as extreme or out there or far-fetched as palatable to reach an audience that they wouldn't otherwise be, I guess, wouldn't be listening to that. And let me just be frank, at the time during Israel's onslaught against Gaza, very few people were making these arguments on television. And when I say very few, I mean almost no one. It was even worse than it was today in so many ways. You certainly didn't get people making the case for a single democratic state, which was even more light years outside of the Overton window than today. Now, I should say that's not to say there weren't far more compelling voices than myself, far more experienced, not least Palestinian people, who were barred and remain largely barred from television. That's a really important caveat for me to add. Now, inevitably, I came under attack because of this performance, including from Douglas Murray in the hard right Spectator magazine. This became something of a theme, as you're gonna see. When Israel unleashed its murderous onslaught against Gaza in 2014, I similarly used my platform in The Guardian just after I joined the newspaper. Some of you may know about my recent expose of the BBC's coverage of Israel's genocide, which I wrote for Dropsite News. Well, I was continuing there a theme I've stuck at for a very long time. The article was written the morning after Israel's murderous onslaught began against Gaza. Now, to pull the curtain back a bit, I had to fight to write that. The view was that my beat was domestic British politics, and I had to fight hard to keep my central arguments intact. One of the main reasons I launched this YouTube channel in November 2020 was because I wanted to have total editorial control over what I wrote about. Now, the article opened with Israel under renewed Hamas attack. This was last night's BBC headline on the escalating bloodshed in Gaza. It is as perverse as Mike Tyson punching a toddler, followed by a headline claiming that the child spat at him. As I wrote in the article, the macabre truth is that Israeli life is deemed by the Western media to be worth more than a Palestinian life. Here is the hierarchy of death at work. According to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, 565 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli security forces since January 2009, while 28 Israeli civilians and 10 Israeli security personnel have been killed. The asymmetry of this so-called conflict is reflected in the death toll, but it is not reflected in the coverage. I noted how the Western media erased Israel's killing of 6 Palestinians, one of them a child, in the West Bank. I then dissected Israel's lies about why they killed those Palestinians, and I concluded the BBC is a public broadcaster, duty-bound to provide balanced reports that accurately reflect the reality on the ground. It is failing to do so, and it is up to licence payers, to whom it is accountable, to demand that it does. So in other words, the long investigative expose I just published about the BBC's coverage of Israel and Palestine built on a critique that I have pushed for a long, long time. Now, during Israel's 2014 onslaught against Gaza, I actively took part in the protests and again used my platform to make the exact same arguments that you've heard me make during this genocide over and over again. This was July 2014. Take a listen.
Israel is armed to the teeth and backed by our Western governments. They are complicit. They are complicit with every death, with every maiming, with every single attack. And that is why we're out with such numbers, not just against the Israeli government, but against our own governments for their role in this massacre. Just to end, this is our message to the Palestinian people. However lonely it may feel, however overwhelming the odds, you have the hearts of billions of people across the world. And we will never, ever give up on you. Free Palestine! Free!
And then I spoke again at the PSC's Palestine protest in August 2014, and you will hear me again make the exact same arguments that I make today.
Friends, in 1 month, 1 in every 1,000 Gazans were murdered by the Israeli state. That is a statistic as horrifying as it gets. Because this is not a conflict. This is not a war. This is a massacre by the occupier against the occupied. Now, our critics often tell us this. They say in a world of such suffering, in a world of such bloodshed, why aren't we out marching about Syria and Iraq? And we do stand in solidarity with Syrians. We do stand in solidarity with Iraqis. But here is the key point to make. Here is the key point. Our governments fund, arm and support Israel. They are complicit with every single Israeli attack, with every single maiming, with every single death. And we will march until our government stop arming and supporting the Israeli occupation. That is why we're out today. Now friends, remember apartheid in South Africa. Remember how strong it seemed. Remember how alarmed. Remember how invincible. Did apartheid not fall? As apartheid fell, the occupation of Palestine will fall as well. That is a certainty. Because all oppression, no matter how strong or well armed or how invincible it seems, will fall. Now friends, this is our message to the Palestinian people. Yes, you're up against the military superpower, armed to the teeth with everything up to including nuclear bombs. Yes, you have the support of Western governments, the Israel. But the difference is this: the Palestinian people have the hearts of billions of us across the world. These are our demands. The West must stop arming Israel. The siege of Gaza must end. Every soldier must leave.
The arguments again I made in support of Palestine led to further attack. From Douglas Murray, for example, in The Spectator, who wrote an article in August 2014 entitled "Owen Jones is lying about Israel, plain and simple." He denounced me for suggesting that the real threat of anti-Semitism came from the far right, the major threat of anti-Semitism. He said it was spearheaded instead by young Muslims in particular, and he said outrageously that I continued to condemn anti-Semitism at the same time assiduously feeding it, cynically conflating critique of Israel's crimes and anti-Semitism, obviously, as we know, a very well-worn attack line, accusing me of painting the background against which acts of violence against Jews took place, pointing, for example, to how I condemned Israel for the massacre of children, declaring that I've revealed the moral sickness of a portion of the left. Clearly, this sort of attack you get from Israel's apologists when you oppose terrible crimes against the Palestinian people. The shameful, in my view, conflation of anti-Semitism with the critiquing of Israel's crimes, which is completely irresponsible given the very real danger of anti-Semitism. But those attacks are attacks I've always had because of my position. Now, in September 2014, I took part in a debate organised by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, again, about that well-worn theme of mine, the BBC's dire coverage of Palestine, alongside Ken Loach. Again, that theme, which I keep returning to, about the BBC's coverage. Unfortunately, the videos of that discussion aren't available, which is a shame. I carried on using my platform to support the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who do crucial work, of course, in Britain in fighting for the liberation of Palestine. Speaking alongside Omar Barghouti, the co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement in March 2015. Now, later that year, Jeremy Corbyn stood to be leader of the Labour Party. There are legitimate criticisms of my position in the Corbyn era. I'll come on to that. But when he stood to be leader in 2015, I campaigned for him, writing my column for The Guardian the day he launched his leadership bid with a piece headlined, "Jeremy Corbyn is in the Labour leadership race. The real debate starts here." And indeed, I recommended him partly on the grounds he was, and I quote, "a proponent of peace and a staunch internationalist." I spoke at rallies in support of his campaign all over the country.
The thing about Jeremy is this: he's someone who stands up for his principles and his convictions and beliefs, no matter what they're throwing. And I hope in the coming weeks, all of us will play our role in getting Jeremy Corbyn elected as Labour leader and beginning the campaign for a different sort of country.
And indeed, I went on television during that leadership campaign to make the case for him over and over and over again, essentially one of the only commentators in the country who did.
I don't think it's a protest vote. I think it patronises people to suggest it is. I think the reason he's doing very well is because he has an optimistic vision, unlike many of his rivals. He took a lot of unpopular calls in the 1980s. He ended up being vindicated in the end.
I can't for the life of me think, well, you're espousing, that should be the way to go.
Owen Mark II, the point I was making was that actually what really resonates...
Well, you are older than me, so yes, Mark.
Oh, blimey, OK. All right,
all right. Boys, all right.
Some age better than others, but...
I think the reason Jeremy Corbyn is doing so well and his opponents are on the back foot is he has an optimistic vision. He's offering policies which I think resonate with people. In that summer of 2015, a smear campaign was directed at him. Now, I wrote a piece for the New Statesman in August, which was in fact headlined, "If Jeremy Corbyn wins, prepare for a firestorm." But I specifically defended Corbyn over attacks over his campaigning on Palestine. In August 2015, writing a Guardian column headlined, "Stand by for more attacks on Corbyn's principled foreign policy stance," noting he was vindicated over the Iraq war. Here he was coming under attack because he'd spoken at pro-Palestine events where he'd met or shared a platform with a Holocaust denier. Now, very important point to make, as I did make at the point I made at the time. Obviously, Jeremy Corbyn abhors those sorts of hateful views. He had no idea, obviously, about this man's hateful views. And anyone who knows anything about Jeremy Corbyn knows that's just a fact. And as I wrote in the piece, as someone who spends a lot of time speaking at events ranging from conferences to protests, though nowhere near as much as Corbyn has over several decades, I know how absurdly impractical it would be to research the background of every other participant. Corbyn himself abhors anti-Semitism, and anti-racism is central to his political DNA, and added the minority who are anti-Semites, like this individual, were not representative of the Palestinian justice movement and had to be unequivocally challenged and driven out, which is, of course, absolutely true. In 2016, I wrote a column in support of boycotts against Israel's occupation for the Guardian newspaper and against attempts by the Conservatives to criminalise those boycotts, headlined, "Boycotts are vital to democracy, so that's why the Tories will ban them," in which I quoted a Jewish peace activist opposing the conflation of Israel and the Jewish people, in which I added, "He is surely right in believing that the government is using the deadly serious issue of anti-Semitism to close down activism centred on the policies of Israel's government." Now, I'll come on to the scrutiny that is valid, but what became known as, in inverted quotes, as the anti-Semitism crisis really came into its own in 2018. And this was a devastating onslaught against the Labour leadership and anyone seen to be supportive of the leadership, which of course included myself. The position I took, I summed up at the time as walking and chewing gum, which is to say that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership and the vast majority of the Labour membership abhorred anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is real and an evil and existed in society and on a fringe of the left, which of course needed to be opposed. Now, I don't apologise for that position because I believe it. It was correct. And that meant I went on television to repeatedly defend Jeremy Corbyn's leadership against these smears, including such a smear in the Murdoch press, which attacked staffers in the Labour leadership office who were in a massive Facebook page or group. Just to have a listen.
Firstly, those in the Labour Party, including the Labour leadership, anti-racism was one of their defining causes. In the 1980s, they were portrayed as the loony left, politically correct, shutting down free speech because of their anti-racism.
What has that got to do with the anti-Semitism argument?
It's to do with the fact that there's an attempt to link the minority, the despicable minority who will be drummed out of the Labour movement and the left, the anti-Semites, the bigots who have nothing to do with socialism, to link that to the Labour leadership. You know what's happening. You know what that front page splash is all about. I'll give you an example. That Sunday Times splash, because you were leading on it the last hour. I did watch, by the way. And
I'm not disputing what may have been done earlier. What I'm saying to you is, isn't the story of the Sunday Times, presumably if the Sunday Times had found any evidence that linked an individual to it, they would have gone on that.
No,
they didn't find that.
What they did is went on Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, with hundreds of thousands of posts, millions probably of comments cumulatively, found despicable racist and anti-Semitic comments, then tried to link that to the fact that there were people within the leader's office who are the most committed anti-racists I've probably ever met. Look, I've got an example here, just to show how these splashes work. This so-called journalism, okay? Where's your camera? This is Conservatives Against the EU. It's a Facebook group. It is full of the most despicable racism I've ever seen.
Presumably the Conservative Party would reject it.
About Gina Miller, for example, F off you foreigner, telling them to go back to your homeland.
Fine.
The most despicable racism. You're not making that. Why isn't that? Why is that?
Because presumably Labour is the story at the moment.
Now, as you can see, I abandoned the usual media etiquette to defend the then Labour leadership against these attacks. Not something you do, incidentally, if it's your media career you're interested in. Indeed, I got attacked as a consequence in right-wing media outlets like the Sun newspaper, a gutter rag, which of course drips with racism. It wrote, "Meanwhile, the Sun can reveal lefty cheerleader Owen Jones accused enemies of Mr. Corbyn of weaponising anti-Semitism" in an astonishing rant posted online. Speaking at a hard left momentum rally in Portsmouth on Thursday night, the mouthy Guardian writer said only a minority of people on the left hated Jews. He said there was a minority of people on the left who were anti-Semitic. There are also people using that and weaponising that issue to portray the whole left as anti-Semitic, and that's false. I presume that's some sort of attempt to paraphrase what I said. But obviously the essence of what I said there is absolutely true. Now, the most notorious attack in this period was so-called Wreathgate, in which Jeremy Corbyn came under attack for laying a wreath in Tunisia in 2014 to remember the victims of the Israeli attack on the PLO's headquarters, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in 1985, because he was pictured near the graves of two senior PLO figures, one of whom was one of the architects of the Munich massacre of 1972. As I wrote, the smear campaign against Jeremy Corbyn over the 2014 visit to Tunis is complete and utter bullshit. And here is why. And I wrote an entire column, that's what that linked to, expanding on that, headlined, "The Corbyn Wreath Scandal is just an exercise in hypocrisy." Other columns I wrote at the time included one headlined, "Saudi Arabia and Israel are killing civilians and Britain is complicit," with a subheading, "The slaughter in Yemen and the Palestinian territories is happening with British arms and support and media silence." Now, when Labour was pushed to adopt the so-called International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, criticised for including examples which conflated legitimate critiques of Israel with anti-Semitism, and we've seen IRA repeatedly since used to silence and suffocate discussion and to silence, of course, critics of Israeli war crimes, I promoted the alternative new code of conduct, which was instead backed by the Labour leadership at the time. And crucially, I did a Guardian video interviewing a British Palestinian lawyer who set out the objections to IRA on the grounds. And the reason I did this video is because Palestinian voices were being erased from the discussion.
Let's be clear about what the IHRA is. It is a document which has a definition of anti-Semitism. Then it has 11 examples of what are anti-Semitic, depending on the context. Which examples are problematic?
From the Palestinian perspective, it really is just two of these so-called illustrative examples of anti-Semitism that we take issue with. And I'm just going to read the text of them because it's easier that way. So the first is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavour. By saying that claiming a state of Israel as a racist endeavour is a kind of anti-Semitism, we fear will descend into prohibiting people from being able to talk about the state of Israel and why or how it is a racist endeavour.
I was using my platform as best I could to challenge IRA, but crucially to platform the voices we needed to hear, which the media were erasing, which were Palestinian voices. Nobody else was doing that. Again, not to, just sing my praises. There are lots of people who would do that. They're not in the mainstream media. I'm not denying that. What I'm talking about is the positions I took using that platform. Now, that same year, I kept plugging away at my bête noire. You guessed it, the BBC's outrageous coverage of Palestine, not least how the BBC website framed the massacre of Palestinian protesters by the Israeli state in Gaza during the Great March of Return. In 2019, I went on BBC Radio 5 and said the idea that in any sense, Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic or racist is an astonishing, outrageous smear. I couldn't find the clip, but BBC 5 Live helpfully have still kept up the image with a quote of what I said. I talked there about things I disagreed with Jeremy Corbyn on. At the time, I was pushing things, just FYI, things like wealth taxes, suggesting Labour could be more radical on economic policy. Anyway, and that year when BBC Panorama did an entire documentary suggesting Labour was anti-Semitic under Jeremy Corbyn, I called it a travesty complete with sinister music and camera work. I noted how it failed to discuss basic details, like how by the summer of 2016, most anti-Semitism cases predated Jeremy Corbyn even becoming leader. And I criticised it for what I believed were its distortions. And I specifically, again, went on television to defend the leadership from these attacks and made that case.
So it shouldn't have been broadcast?
I think it should have been a balanced broadcast. It should have had a range of voices. It shouldn't have edited emails. Why edit an email to make it look like the exact opposite? Don't listen to me on this. People go, well, you would say that you're a bit lefty and all the rest of it.
But the point,
journalists, just quickly, no, this is important.
I have to say, the reason I find some of the harsh criticisms I get about this period sometimes difficult to stomach is, to be blunt, during these moments, why I was on television. I'll tell you why I was on television. Because actual shadow cabinet members on the left did not want to do it. And I get it. Not exactly enjoyable. You get smeared, your career gets menaced, you get a ton of death threats. But I think batting for the truth is important. But I was filling a vacuum because actual left-wing MPs didn't want to go and do it. I'm just being honest there. Now, some of the criticisms I've had is that I backed action taken against anti-Semitism by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and his ally, Jenny Formby, who became General Secretary of Labour, including suspending and removing members. Well, yeah, I'm not apologetic about that. And indeed, one of the defences I made in this period and since is that Jeremy Corbyn's leadership accelerated such action. Because when the right wing of the Labour Party were in charge of the party machine, they weren't taking proper action. Which is what's so ludicrous. The whole narrative was upside down. I mean, it was just ridiculous gaslighting. Anyway, I was trying to tell the truth. I was trying to push the reality. And that's what actually happened. And this isn't to say, by the way, there aren't valid criticisms to make of me in the Corbyn era. There absolutely are. During his second 2016 leadership bid, when there was attempted coup against him by Labour MPs, yes, I voted for him as leader, but I was very critical. Those critiques focused on communication. Before the 2017 general election was called, I said those communication failures in particular risked a terrible election defeat for which the left would be blamed. This came after defeats in by-elections and Labour with catastrophic polling. And I suggested publicly that Jeremy Corbyn should be replaced with someone else with the same politics. And some people, very understandably, to be honest, were very, very angry about it. Some still are. I get that. It was a big mistake on my part. And I would say, without hesitation, that criticism is justified. Because the view of people was, look, we don't have representation in the media. Basically, we're one of the only people we've got. And we expect you to go out unequivocally and fight for left-wing ideas. And on this, the view was that I failed. And I did. Absolutely right. And as it happened, when the election was called, and I threw everything into that general election at the time, by the way, for example, again, going on television to defend Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, for example, when it very correctly made the case that the hideous terrorist bombings, for example, on the Manchester Arena, should be placed in the context of British foreign policy. But thanks to the transformative policies, which were finally put front and centre in that general election in 2017, Labour support surged and the Tories lost their majority. Labour got 40% of the vote. Now, I was proven wrong, thankfully. You know, sometimes I joke that I was saved by the Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May, who called that election. Politically, I was definitely going melty, for want of a better word. And that election, thanks to my beloved Theresa May, led me to firm up my politics, which is why when Labour was defeated catastrophically in 2019, I stood, as I think you can see, consistently by my socialist politics. I haven't given an inch. If anything, I'm probably more radical than I was in 2019. And, you know, I didn't shapeshift like a political opportunist, like to be blunt, others have done. Life would be easier in lots of ways. But, you know, I learned a lesson, which is important. But I'm saying all of this, none of that had anything to do with Palestine, or indeed the conflation of anti-Semitism, an extremely real evil, with the question of Palestine. But some specific criticisms have come up, which, again, deliberately strip out of context what I think and what I did. Let's start with this one. One is that I spoke at a meeting of the Jewish Labour movement in 2017. That's Labour's only affiliated Jewish organisation. The basis for this critique comes from the fact, not that it's a Jewish organisation, I'm sure people wouldn't, I'd hope, criticise me for that, but that its constitution states that one of its values is to promote the centrality of Israel in Jewish life. Why did I speak there? Very straightforward answer. The father of my best friend, I was best man at his wedding, he was best man at mine, died. His father died. JLM asked me to do a lecture there in his father's memory, which after consulting the family, I did. I'd note the same year, Jeremy Corbyn also spoke at a JLM meeting. Now, when I came under attack for doing so, I wrote one post which stated, I'm a passionate supporter of Palestinian justice. My views on Palestine haven't changed one jot. I wrote, Palestine currently languishes under brutal occupation and is deprived of one of the most fundamental rights, the right to national self-determination. Israel's hard-right government is expanding illegal settlements. The Israeli government has subjected Gaza to brutal sieges and military offensives, which have killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians. My opposition to these horrors hasn't weakened one bit. And added that I supported a just peace for both Arabs and Jews, which I stand by, as well as my opposition to anti-Semitism. In the lecture itself, I did a pitch at, I guess you would say, middle of the road, Jewish Brits. You have committed, for example, anti-Zionist Jewish Brits. You have die-hard right-wing Zionists. And I was pitching at those who were neither, to try and win them over to the Palestinian cause. That was my thinking. That's what was going on in my head, if you will. Now, I wrote up this pitch, and it's been presented as if I was presenting this pitch as being the core strategy of the Palestinian solidarity movement, which would be in itself extremely arrogant, rather than a very specific pitch towards Jewish Brits at a Jewish Labour movement meeting. So that included talking about the specific horror of the Shoah, in which 6 million European Jews, of course, were murdered by the Nazis, listening to the lived experience of Jewish people when they talked about anti-Semitism, building a Palestinian solidarity movement where British Jews who are genuinely committed to the end of the occupation and settlements feel welcome, and then demanding the immediate end of the occupation of Palestinian land, the end of the blockade of Gaza, the dismantling of all settlements, boycotts of products made in illegal settlements of Palestinian land, I'll come on to that, an arms embargo against Israel and other human rights abusing states, solidarity with those Israeli peace activists fighting for Palestinian justice. The latter is something you've seen me do on this channel repeatedly by platforming such voices. Now, I'm currently coming under attack for this specifically, which I'll be honest, I think is wild. It's also bemusing because I was actually heckled at the lecture over the case I made for Palestinian liberation. But I don't think there's anything wrong with pitching arguments in support of Palestinian liberation to what could be described as floating Jewish voters. Again, what I've always tried to do is try and pitch to the unpersuaded and the unconvinced. And look, I know that works. I know that works because I read my correspondence. I read the comments. You know, there's a Jimmy the Giant, look him up. He's a brilliant YouTuber. He used to be on the alt-right.
I stumbled across a geezer called Owen Jones.
And what Chavs argued.
And yeah, I mean, again, it sounds extremely arrogant of mine, but he did a whole video in which he cited in part my influence in shifting into the left. That's the whole point. That's what I'm trying to do. That's my project. You know? Why do you think I'm doing this? It's nice to talk partly to people who already agree, and I'm trying to spur, people who agree into action. I'm trying to spread information regardless, but I want to persuade people. I read the comments, and the best comments I read are people who talk, or the correspondence I get, are people who've changed their mind. The critique I would make reading back, though, is, for example, I wrote in that pitch about being committed to the objective of Palestinian liberation and freedom with a two-state solution guaranteeing peace and stability for all. Now, to be honest, other than Question Time in 2012, I almost always steered away from the question of an end state on the pragmatic grounds it should be decided on the basis of negotiation as long as, for example, the occupation, the settlements, the siege and so on ended. I still don't think me as a white Brit should be dictating these things. At the time, it had been put to me that there was very little meaningful support for one-state solution, a democratic one-state solution in the polling of either Palestinians or Jewish Israelis. And to be honest, Jeremy Corbyn then and since has made the case for a two-state solution. I'm not sure where he's currently at. I haven't asked him. But I would say he's one of the most courageous and principled champions of Palestinian liberation. I don't think him having argued that position contradicts that. Now, my own personal preference, caveat, as someone who is a white Brit in a country which, let's be honest, its elites have caused so many of the world's problems, including in this particular area, is what I argued for on Question Time. A single democratic state with equal rights for all, like South Africa, is my preference. However hard that might be to achieve, by the way. We shouldn't be naive about that. That's certainly where I am now. That's something I've firmed up on. The other criticism I get refers to an interview I did at the time with the Jewish Chronicle. And I'm not going to lie, that interview was a big mistake. From what I remember, extremely leading questions in which I was tripped up, not least on the question of boycotts, which I'd written about in The Guardian. And indeed, it omitted my answers, chopped them up, wasn't an accurate representation of the things that I've argued for, as you can see, over many years. I mean, there was some stupid criticism. Well, I'll give you an example, actually. So, for example, in it said about how I was looking forward, I think, to go to Israel and the Palestinian territories. I was talking about how I'd been invited by a pro-Palestinian group to go to the occupied Palestinian lands. I mean, and then this was portrayed as though I was, I don't know, going to go with what? I don't know, Israeli lobbyists? I don't know what the criticism is, but that's, again, one of the things which has come up, which is just not true. You know, I'd always backed, as you can see, sanctions, boycotts, and written about that in The Guardian, but there was certainly a chunk in there with leading questions about boycotts, which ended up just awfully represented. I used my platform to properly back the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in The Guardian in 2021 in a piece headlined, "Denied a state, Palestinians are now denied a say in their own future." And earlier that same year, I published a video on my channel entitled "The Case for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions." I definitely should have come out earlier in support of BDS, and I completely accept that's a mistake. That is a completely legitimate critique. Again, I don't think I'm the only one who's gone on a journey there. I think those journeys are important. I want more people to go on that journey. I mean, Jamie Corbyn was asked about this in 2017, and he didn't back BDS. I bet he does now. Again, it doesn't stop the fact he is and was and will always be a very eloquent champion of the Palestinian people, far more eloquent and courageous than myself. And he was partly vilified for that. There's no question about that. Now, the final critique, which keeps coming up, focuses on a book I wrote about the Labour left called "This Land, the Struggle for the Left." This, for me, really is the most frustrating criticism. You see, there's a chapter in which I do a potted history of the left's changing relationship with Israel and Palestine. It wasn't a chapter about my personal views. It was supposed to be a detached academic history, or semi-academic, whatever, of how the left went from a pretty slavish pro-Israel perspective, I would say, to championing the Palestinian cause. It's not a good history, by the way, in terms of the history of what the left has done. You know, the left was not in a good place originally at all. It's quite shameful history in lots of ways, which lots of people don't know about. You see, the official communist movement in 1948 backed Israel's foundation. The Soviet Union was the first country to de jure recognize Israel, and leading luminaries of the Labour left supported it. People may remember, for example, Eric Heffer. He was the stalwart left-wing Labour MP, famously walked off the stage when Neil Kinnock denounced Militant in 1985, committed Zionist. Tony Benn used to be in Labour Friends of Israel, which, you know, he ended up, obviously, an incredibly committed champion of the Palestinian people. Now, the book, this section of that chapter, looked at why. Why was the left originally in this place, and why did it change? And I wrote about how they originally saw it as a socialist project, which then overtly became a state which never claimed any such thing, and how the left's views changed because of the aftermath of the occupation of the West Bank in Gaza from 1967 onwards, when they then linked it to how they saw colonialism in the rest of the world, which they didn't before. Now, that doesn't mean I personally thought it was a socialist project. You can't have socialism and ethnically cleanse people and deprive and occupied people of their freedoms. Obviously, Israel was never any sort of socialist endeavour. So, for example, people who quote from this chapter as though I said there was an incontestable need for a Jewish state in 1948. What I was actually writing about was, why did Zionism go from a minority strain amongst Jewish people to dominant strain after the Holocaust? We're talking about how it seemed to them that there was an incontestable need. That's not my view. It's not my position. I was discussing what happened. Again, it's not a summary of my opinions. I also discussed how it differed from other settler colonial projects which planted the flag down of the country they were from. But again, I wasn't disputing that Israel is a settler colonial project, which of course it is. Settler colonialism takes many different forms. Now, you can discuss the different rationales, if you like, which is what I was talking about. It's the rationales for settler colonialism and how it differed. But that doesn't stop settler colonialism being a terrible injustice. You can discuss the different rationales and how they come about, but it doesn't mean settler colonialism, as it is felt, as it is suffered by those who are colonised, is anything other than a terrible injustice. So this has been a long video. But it is important to speak the truth about my record, about my position. I've consistently used my platform, as you can see from the evidence, to support the struggle for Palestinian liberation. I've consistently fought against the deliberate conflation of that struggle with the genuine evil of anti-Semitism, which I've consistently opposed and will always do. And That's why that demarcation is so important. The attempt to trash the demarcation is irresponsible, to say the least. It doesn't mean I've always got it right. It doesn't mean the language I use was always right. But claims circulating amongst some that I'm some pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian stooge are, I'm just going to say it, deranged. The context I've given you is why, as soon as the genocide began, I made a pact with myself to use my platform as best I could to oppose what I knew from the very beginning would be a abominable crime. And I took the view, and the pact I made with myself is, do not waver on that, whatever the consequences. I'll give you an example. On the 10th of October 2023, I was pre-booked to go on Sky News. I'd been booked to go on that before 7th of October had happened. And I was booked to go on with the right-wing Labour MP, Margaret Hodge. I was the first British journalist to go on television and make these arguments, and you can listen to what happened.
Already, the Israeli government, which is a far-right government, have made clear that they will institute a policy of collective punishment. The defence minister said, I've ordered a complete siege in the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly. That is the language of war crimes. It is illegal under international law to impose collective punishment on a people. 80%. I've let you speak. So you're going to respond. 80% of those who live in Gaza, which is an open-air prison, depend on humanitarian aid.
But you're not acknowledging, Owen. You're not acknowledging, Owen.
Margaret, I've let you speak at great length.
I tell you what I can't stand is that you're using the horrors that we've experienced in the last 3 days to bang the drum about an issue that you've been banging the drum on forever.
No, I'm not.
And what I think you should really think about is how the people of Israel who have now been there for, have nowhere else to go.
Margaret,
they have nowhere else to go.
Is it possible for me to respond? Right now, Palestinian children whose life is as sacred as a child in Israel are being slaughtered. They are dying, okay? Now, 50% of the... Please let me finish.
I'll let you come in.
50% of the population of the Gaza Strip are children. And those children are being bombed by a government which has said that we are fighting human animals and we act accordingly. Benjamin Netanyahu demanded the civilians of Gaza Strip leave. You cannot leave the Gaza Strip. It is under blockade by air, sea and land. Now, 96%... Okay. Please let me finish.
Yeah, I will, but...
96%, because Margaret spoke at length, 96% of those who have died in the last 15 years are Palestinians.
No one speaks out about Palestine because they think it's good for their career, unless they are completely delusional. Which is why, as you may have noticed, I've been blacklisted from almost every TV channel. I used to be a regular on several TV programmes. That's no longer true. Well, so what? So what? Palestinian journalists are being slaughtered in the biggest massacre of journalists in the history of human civilization. What I have tried to do with this channel and my platform is consistently oppose this genocide, consistently take on the role of the Western media and our rulers, and to platform, crucially, voices that other media outlets erase. That doesn't mean I shouldn't be scrutinised. It doesn't mean I shouldn't be critiqued. It doesn't mean that I don't get things wrong. But I just want to end by saying this, and this I think is important. There are two strategies if you're someone who supports any struggle for justice. You can do your best to speak to as many people as you can, to win over the unpersuaded, to build support without watering down what you think. That's been the aim of this channel. And since this genocide began, literally millions of people have watched these videos, whether that be on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter, and so on. Crucially, people who otherwise were not watching those sorts of videos. And obviously, you've all made that possible. For those who regard me as beyond the pale, presumably they feel it would be better for this cause if my channel no longer existed and wasn't putting out content opposed to the genocide. Well, I think that's sad, but if you really think this content is secretly helpful to the Israeli state, go and speak to their apologists, because that's certainly news to them. Or there's a second strategy. Only speak to those who are already persuaded. Only speak to the most radical who are already persuaded. Denounce those who just aren't pure enough. And decide instead that you want to shrink the movement as long as you can be allowed a voice in a smaller movement, not convincing or persuading a single person. Well, I'm going to be honest. I think that's self-indulgent. And I think it's self-indulgent to say the least. I actually think when it comes to fighting genocide, that approach is unforgivable. If there are those who want to denounce me as a raging Zionist, a stooge of Israel and all the rest, can't stop you. But even if you disagree with me, I think you can see that I've used my platform as long as I've had it as best I can to support Palestinian liberation, including at times when, obviously, that's not, well, it's never the fashionable thing to do, is it? That's the reality of the world in which we live. Have my views become firmer? Yes, absolutely. But I've always been on this side. And to conclude, and I hope this sets the record straight, and I'm sorry this is self-indulgent and wasting time and energy, I'm not that interesting. And I'm actually not that complicated. I don't have a load of secret ulterior motives. I'm just doing my best to use my platform as effectively as I can in what is, I'm sorry to say, a very dark period in human history, and a period which is, I'm afraid, only going to get darker still. Now, my commitment is to keep doing everything I can with my platform, as long as I have it, to oppose one of the worst crimes of our age. And all I'd say is, I hope that should be the focus of everybody who has a platform right now. Please like and subscribe. As ever, leave your thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Critique me, fine. Honestly, please do. You know, I like being critiqued. I've learned that way. We all learn that way. Just, you know, think things, you know, people can be reasonable as well, but you can be unreasonable. It's your call. Do share the video, including to those who obviously think I'm a crazy right-wing Zionist. You can help us as we expand our operation at patreon.com/OwenJazz84. Listen to the podcast. You'll see, I'm hiring this brilliant person. We're expanding. That's all thanks to you. Like, subscribe. Good for the algorithm. I will speak to you in a bit.